No mai haere mai, the Gisborne District Council would like to extend a warm welcome to you all and thank you for connecting to this online hui about one of the topics we're seeking your feedback on for our 2021 to 2031 long-term plan, also referred to as the LTP. The LTP sets out our work for the next 10 years. This webinar begins with 2 presentations, followed by a question and answer section at the end. Thank you to those who have submitted questions via Facebook and email. If you want to ask a question, please do so in the chat function below, along with an email address in case we can't respond live and we need to get back to you. If you're watching the replay of this webinar, this online hui, and you have a question, please send it to feedback@gdc.govt.nz. Today, we're talking about our environment, specifically climate change and environmental care. Our webinar begins today with presentations, firstly from Hannah Steans, Policy Planner, and secondly, we will hear from Dr. Murry Cave, Principal Scientist here at GDC. Tēnā korua, I now hand over to you both.
Rena.
Thanks, Marere. Kia ora everybody. As Marere said, my name is Hannah Steans and I'm going to start us off with our presentations today. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. One moment. Hopefully I can get this to work. Perfect. So I'm a policy planner here at the council, and today I'm going to talk to you about responding to climate change and how that relates to our 2021 to 2031 LTP or long-term plan. So today we only have about 15 minutes, so it's going to be quite a high-level presentation. I'm going to cover climate change impacts and implications, an overview of our regional emissions inventory, and highlights of work that council's been doing so far, and some next steps. Right, so here's a diagram from the Ministry for the Environment. It highlights the projected impacts for climate change in New Zealand, and as you can see, they are quite widespread, ranging from less snow and ice to warmer oceans, more floods, more droughts and wildfires. This is quite a simplistic diagram, and when we look at Tadafadi specific implications, some will be more relevant, such as drought and wildfires, and some will be less relevant, like looking at snow and ice. The extent of these impacts will depend on the amount of greenhouse gases we have in our atmosphere. For example, if we focus all of our efforts on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the implications will be less than if we continue on our business as usual trajectory or continue as we are at the moment. We've currently got NIWA working to complete a study on the specific Tadafadi implications, and it's actually a joint study with our neighbours in the Hawke's Bay. When it is finished, which is likely to be in the next couple of months, we can give a lot more detail to what areas in the region are likely to be most affected by these changes. So, for example, we might be able to see areas that are more affected by droughts and maybe areas that are more affected by floods, and we can dial down to those really specific, location-specific implications. Now I have a short video for you. This is from our lovely friends at NIWA, and I just thought that they would be able to show you some of the implications a lot better through a video than I will be speaking about them. Now I'll just give it a go and make sure it works. With me. Now I'm not sure that you can hear that sound, so I'll just speak to the video. So short video from NIWA, who are a Crown Research Institute in New Zealand, and their work is integral to understanding the implications of climate change for New Zealand. And we'll just watch the video. It's got some really interesting impact. What the video shows is we're already experiencing some natural hazards, and some of those can be exacerbated by climate change. So we're looking at drought, impacts to our oceans. So ocean acidity can have a real impact on our shellfish and their ability to grow their shells. We've seen a lot of flooding lately in New Zealand, which has devastated a lot of communities. Apologies, the text isn't quite in the screen. And now it's kind of showing what NIWA does in their research. So they've got different ways of collecting data. And this is some of their mapping work for other regions. Again, apologies for the text. Alrighty, so what I really like about the ending of that video is that it shows that we all have a role to play in adapting to climate change. It is not just a job for central government, it's not just a job for local government or the private sector. We actually all need to work together to ensure that that we are prepared and it's an outcome that is good for us in Tadafadi. So thank you to NIWA for that video. Now I'm just going to try and get to my next slide. There we go. And so when you look at all of those implications and impacts from climate change, it can all get a bit depressing, really. You can see and how natural hazards can have a significant adverse effect on our communities. So I just wanted to touch on some positive projects that have been happening in New Zealand lately. Firstly, central government. So the Ministry for the Environment have just completed a national climate change risk assessment. This was something they had to do under the Zero Carbon Act 2019. It's the first assessment of its kind for New Zealand. And what the report did was identify 43 priority risks. Now, this was across 5 domains: natural environment, human, economy, built environment, and governance. And this table here shows the 10 most significant risks. And as you can see, there's 2 from each domain, and it can range from risks to coastal ecosystems, indigenous ecosystems, social cohesion, inequalities, economic costs, and then financial system, and right down to the top 2, which are both in the built environment. So the first one, the top risk, so that's an extreme consequence rating and a high urgency rating, which you can see on the right side of the table. So risks to potable water supplies, both availability and quality, due to changes in rainfall, temperature, drought, extreme weather events, and ongoing sea level rise. And the second highest one was risk to buildings due to extreme weather events, drought, increased fire weather, and ongoing sea level rise. So what the government will do now is take a look at these top 10 risks and develop a national adaptation plan. And we will have a chance to feed into this process. So that's both us at local government and the community. And so keep an eye out on any news from the Ministry for the Environment and make sure that you have your say to ensure that we can get the needs and aspirations of Tadafadi encompassed in this national adaptation plan. And the Climate Change Commission will review this in 6 years, and then they'll have another go at a national adaptation plan to make sure we're keeping on track and that the adverse effects of these implications of climate change are minimised, and we can start to look at some of the opportunities that might arise. And then we have a positive example happening in the local government sphere. So our neighbours in Hawke's Bay have been doing some adaptation planning. So what they did was set out on a 4-year project to complete a coastal hazards plan or strategy. And they divided the most inhabited section of their coast up into different cells, and you can see them here on the left side of the table. And so there was a lot of community consultation and research to look at what the specific implications of climate change would be in these areas and how the community needed to respond to meet the needs and aspirations of the different areas and responding to the different geography and what was actually feasible. So you can see in the short term, so they've got 3 different time periods: short term, medium term, and long term. So many of them focused in the short term on sort of status quo or seawalls, which can be quite expensive to maintain. They do have their purpose, but you can sort of see that in the long term, they decided to go for a lot more sort of transformational approach. You can see a lot more managed retreat here. So that means they've decided that as a community, they realize that they won't be able to live in this area in the future. So now that they've got this table, what they're working through is how they actually implement it. So the first stop for the community will be figuring out how they pay for each of the options. So how they pay to maintain or build a seawall, and then and manage retreat and so on. So this is looking at this point like it might be a targeted rate on some of the communities, but that's something that they're going to work through, and it's a sort of a watch this space. So now we've talked a lot about implications and adaptation. What about the other side of the coin? So now we're just going to touch on our missions. So must have been the end of last year, Trust Tadafadi and GDC teamed up to co-fund an emissions inventory for the region, and it was for the financial year 2018-2019. And it was quite interesting because what the emissions inventory showed was what actually a lot of people thought or guessed, that Tadafadi is in fact a net sink of carbon. So as you can see on the right hand side, our gross emissions were just over 2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, but our net emissions were negative. So that means our forestry absorbed a lot more emissions than we produced. Now, if we go to this graph here, you can see that agriculture was our top contributor to our emissions at 82%. Now, most of this came from enteric fermentation, which is also known as cows and sheep burping. And then we have our transportation at 11%, and most of this was diesel on road, so that's our trucks on the road. And stationary energy was 5%. So most of this was kind of split three ways. Energy consumption, so not energy consumption, electricity consumption, our natural gas, and things like petrol and diesel use in stationary energy, so stuff like your generators. And lastly, we have two small wedges. That's our waste. Most of this is from our solid waste, so our landfills, and then IPPU, which isn't a big part of the region. It's kind of like manufacturing and things that come from emissions that come from refrigeration. So this inventory followed global best practice, which is quite useful because most of the regions in New Zealand use it. So what we can do is we can compare ourselves to other areas of New Zealand. So how do we compare? So our consultants pulled out some areas across the North Island that had kind of similar inventories to us. And you can see we're kind of just above Wairarapa. So Wairarapa covered the South Wairarapa, Masterton and Carterton areas. But you can see our the way the emissions are distributed, it's mostly agriculture and then a bit of transport, waste and so on. I just wanted to touch on a couple of points before I move on. Because we have popped out as a net carbon sink, this doesn't mean we can rest on our laurels and do nothing. We need to continue to try and be more sustainable. Doesn't mean we'll be a carbon sink forever. Different things happen with our forestry. So yeah, we need to still do our best to be more sustainable and reduce our emissions. The second thing is it's just a model. It's quite simplistic. So for example, our agriculture has come up as the top, but we need to look at it as a holistic approach. We're part of the New Zealand community and part of the global community, so we can't look at these things in isolation. I would take agriculture as an example. Recent research has showed that in New Zealand, we actually have less emissions intensive agriculture than other parts of the world. So we need to consider all of those layers when we look at how we're going to move forward and make sure that we are having a just transition to a low emissions economy. So I know I'm probably running out of time. I didn't put my timer on, sorry guys. So I'll just race through these last ones. And what have we been doing to respond here at GDC? Well, across council, we have been doing several different things. In our design of our infrastructure, such as our stormwater and our stop banks, we have been incorporating our climate change projections within the design. We have also been looking at the future of our water. So we know that water availability will be a challenge for us in the future. So there are teams looking at managed aquifer recharge and alternate use and disposal of wastewater. So what you can do is treat your wastewater and use it for things like irrigation. And that's a emerging aspect of science, which is quite interesting. We also have people looking at implementing our waste management minimization plan. I hope that I've got that around the right way. So making sure that we're minimizing the waste we put on, which will therefore decrease our emissions. And we have some really cool biodiversity projects, which Murry will touch on in his presentation. And so, for example, Tatarangi and Wainaki, and they're sort of two-pronged in their benefits. They're both increase carbon sequestration and regulate temperature, which can help us adapt. As a council, we're also been transitioning to electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, which can help reduce our emissions as an organisation. And we've also been, I think we're halfway through transitioning our streetlights to LED. We've also been working with central government to keep abreast of the work they're doing and ensure that we're advocating for our region. So last but not least, the crux of my presentation, what's next? So we know we're only at the start of the journey, and we know that local government has a key part to play in our response to climate change. Our councillors in June last year decided they wanted to take a region-wide leadership approach, so that covers mitigation, adaptation and education. So we want to develop a comprehensive plan that shows how we will do this. What we would like for you to tell us is how you would like us to show leadership. So part of the long-term plan early engagement is that we have a survey on our website, gdc.govt.nz, and there's a climate change section. So there's a few questions like, what do you think about flood mitigation schemes? Do you think we should do more or less? Coastal protection, more or less? Biodiversity, more or less, or the same, sorry. And also the question about leadership. So we'd love to hear from you and your views. Thank you, and I think I'm going to pass over to Murry now, and then there's a section at the end where we can ask questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Hannah, and morning, everybody. And as Hannah has indicated, I'm going to start talking about more along the biodiversity space and what's happening there and what we can be doing. And again, I'm going to be taking a bit of a holistic view. I'm going to be looking back and then seeing what we can learn from what happened in the past and where we could be going in the future. So I'm now going to go and kick off my presentation. So hold on a minute while I share the screen and get that going. Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is environmental care. And I've subtitled this, Healing the Land or Restoring the Whenua. And we think of what we're seeing here today really in the light of just the short term, but in reality, Tadafadi is still healing from the impacts of Cyclone Bola. And going forward, it's going to be the sustainable use of the land that's going to be key to the social economic well-being for the people of Tadafadi. Okay, we need to learn from the past. Tadafadi today reflects past practices and decisions that have been made that result in the intergenerational transfer of some difficult problems, erosion, the lack of biodiversity within the region, and a range of things, the conflicts between forestry and farming, for example. So the real key point is to identify the right land use for our lands that will allow for a more sustainable... John Scott. My apologies. Anyway, to identify the right land use for our lands to allow for more sustainable social and economic development, which will help the land to heal. We have the opportunity as a community to participate in what the future of Tadafadi will look like, where farming, the environment, forestry and other land uses all contribute to our well-being. We need to learn from the past. Now, on the one side of the screen there, you have what looks like slash on the beach, but this is actually from the original clearing of the land after the colonial period where there was the introduction of pastoral farming in the region. Now, that had a similar effect to what we see today, but we have to look at the past and say, okay, this is what happened in the past, we need to learn from that. And that practice in the past culminated in Cyclone Bola in the 1980s, where a lot of the area was in pastoral farming, and the cyclone Bola came through and the land could not cope with the impact that that storm had, which was a 150-year storm, a significant storm, but that in the context of climate change may be a more frequent event in the future. But now what happened then was we put in a lot of large-scale pine forest afforestation to reduce the erosion. But those forests, which are now being harvested, were put in there for protection purposes. And at the time, when the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and others were actually thinking about what we needed to do in Tadafadi to solve the problem of erosion post-Bola, they didn't really think about what happened when harvest was happening. And we've seen in the last few years, this photograph here is of what happened at Tolaga Bay in 2012, and successive times after that in other beaches and Tolaga Bay, we've had the impacts of logging waste on our beaches, and something that's an issue we need to solve. And that's an active problem, and we're also actively working on solutions. The key thing about it is getting looked to the right land use. And we've got two images on this page here. The first key point I want to make is that you can actually have farming and forestry living together, working together. And so we have here an area where we've got pastoral farming adjacent to pine afforestation in the Tapua Roa and the Waipu catchment. And again, in the Waipu catchment, we can see where there are areas where permanent Indigenous cover really does help protect the land. And now we're getting to the stage which is the nitty-gritty of it, which is where we can come towards what I call healing the land. And this is where we are changing land use to actually better address the problems that we can have in some areas. The Wainaki Restoration Project brings together iwi and the council to heal a risky, vulnerable landscape, and that will help us to permanently protect the Gisborne water supply catchment, which at the top is the Wainaki and further down the Te Arai. And so this is a very large area of what's currently in pine forest, and most of that's been converted over the next 10 years through to Indigenous cover, starting with Manaka in the key areas, and then the taller podocarps as well. And so this is a photograph from the other day where the local iwi were there putting in healing stones and planting some podocarps. On the other side, we've got to remember that the city as well is an area where we've had quite a significant degree of impact. And so here, the Wakanai Stream project is one where we've got the community. Here is our Puni School on the margins of the Wakanai Stream, helping to restore an urban wetland. And I wanted to have not too long a talk today rather than allow time for questions, but on one side of the screen here, you can see an actively eroding what I call a mega gully system in the Waipu catchment, surrounded by regenerating Manaka scrub on what was originally pasture. But then on the other side, you can see the end result, where Manaka has actually now fully developed in one of these damaged gully systems, and the landscape has effectively become healed. And you can see here that you've still got pastoral farming going on, but the impacts of the pastoral farming has been significantly reduced compared to what it was in Cyclone Bola's day. So here we're actually really at a crossroads, I think, in my point of view, where through appropriate decision-making and appropriate guidance from the community, we can move from a situation where we've had some pretty unsustainable land uses, pastoral farming in very, very steep, vulnerable sites, forestry in sites which probably should be in permanent forest cover. And we can move from that through to a system where each land use is in the right place, doing the right thing, and our social and economic well-being is looked after. So thank you very much. And that's the end of my little side presentation. Time for questions, perhaps.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Murray. Thank you, Hannah. We'll start with this question here. I would like to ask if there are any plans by the GDC to actively regulate the spraying and burning of vast areas of Kānuka forest in this region for pasture. I think that's a question for you, Dr. Murray.
Okay, well, currently dealing with the sort of the clearance of Indigenous scrub, Manaka and Kānuka, is covered by the Tarafuti Regional Management Plan. And that does allow for up to 1 hectare of Mānuka Kānaka to be removed in any 1 year. But that is really unsustainable going forward, and particularly in areas which are extremely vulnerable. So it does require consent at the moment if it's more than 1 hectare, but of course we can get the situation where we have 1 hectare 1 year, another hectare the next. Where we do spot wholesale clearance without consent, then there is an active consent compliance process that can go on after that. Going forward, we do have the situation where we now have the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity, and that will put far greater constraints on what is used with respect to the land, and particularly with respect to the clearance of Indigenous bush. And so that will be something that we have to deal with when we update the regional management plan going forward, which is a process we're kicking off now.
Thank you for that. Your screen is a little bit, is lagging slightly, but your audio is fine, so we can hear those answers. There's a question here in the chat, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure it wasn't raised. Was the scale of CO2 emissions from Paukahu discussed? And if it wasn't, what GDC's plans to address this problem? Do we have an answer for that now?
And that needs to be unmuted.
Oh, I apologize. Hannah?
Sorry about that. Kia ora, Ian. Thank you for your question. And no, actually, I didn't have time to cover our corporate or GDC emissions profile in the presentation, but that is a really good question. So what we've done is we've just finished our GDC emissions profile, and our closed landfill came up as one of the top emitters. So the issue is, I believe, that once a landfill is closed, it can be difficult to insert the technology for methane capture. So what we need to do is talk to our peers. I believe that Upper Hutt is having a similar issue, and that their closed landfills are also a major contributor to their footprint. And we need to look at some of the responses that we can feasibly do from an engineering perspective, and then the costs involved. So I think, is that correct about the technology, Murry? I just wanted to check that I'm telling you the right thing.
Yes, there are in a lot of other landfills, and it has been done with the legacy ones as well, where you actually try to extract the methane out. It's not as efficient as if you design a new landfill and manage the process from scratch, but it has been tried. Silverstream in Lower Hutt was one where they started out with the legacy landfill they have there, and then they progressively put in more technology as they went forward, and they essentially used the offtake gas for power generation, and that could be a solution here as well. Power generation wouldn't necessarily be for overall use, but it can be used for load control on our power system here, where we have what's called a long spur, and that means that our voltage drops off from the significant distance we have from the generation source, and that sort of landfill gas can be used to actually boost our electricity voltage on our lines.
Thank you, Murry. And I guess, Ian, what we can do is when we look at our council climate change plan, that'll be one of the key things we're looking at, and how we can respond in a way that has positive impacts. Thank you.
Thank you too. I'm just going to, if we can, use this opportunity to really inform our people about what we're asking them from, what we're asking them for in our feedback that we're collecting. So with regards to our climate change, and I've put the link in the chat there where you can park your feedback. Can we just speak to a little bit about flood mitigation schemes like the Waipawa flood control scheme? What does that mean? And what will it mean if we do more of those, or if we do less, or if we do the same?
Okay. interesting question. So the Waipawa flood control scheme is obviously in place already, and so what the project we are posing is to do is to build our stop banks higher so that it can protect the Tatarangi flats from bigger floods. And what climate change is doing is making what could be a 1 in 100 year flood to maybe a 1 in 10 year flood, something along those lines. So our NIWA study will make those implications clearer. Any protection scheme can be quite expensive for our region. So basically, it's not only the initial construction, but it is also the maintenance of that scheme. So that's something we really want to understand, is where you value the different protection schemes. So not only the Waipawa scheme, but also you can do protection on the coast. So that's seawalls or different things like that. Yeah, again, they have a cost with them. So there are other things you can do in certain cases, like at the coast, you can do things like dune restoration or beach renourishment. So what we really want to know is what you think about those schemes and whether they are something that you value. And Murry, would you like to add anything?
Okay, I was just going to say that we are going to be doing some other longer term looking at the entire Waipawa River system. We're really lucky now that we've had early LIDAR over that area from 2005, and we've just reflown LIDAR over the entire region, which we now have got 100% coverage of. And so what we're going to do in this next year is that we're going to look at the difference in the Waipawa River between what the LIDAR told us in 2005 and the LIDAR now, and that should be able to tell us where big pulses of sediment are coming down the river, or whether or not the river itself is stabilizing. And this is quite important, not just from controlling longevity of the flood control scheme itself, but also the degree of nourishment of the beach at Midway and Wainaki from the sediment that comes down from the river. And there are some obvious climate change implications if the amount of sediment is dropping because of improved land use. The Wainaki Midway beaches have been accreting over the last many years, and that's been due to the amount of erosion going on the headwaters, and so that sediment coming down and being deposited on the beaches. And we need to know what is the impact on the Waipawa and on the city if that sediment no longer arrives. Will there be a stabilization point where there will be no more accretion of the beach, and maybe there will be erosion of the beach? And we just, at this stage, we don't know that. So this is a question we need to have answered. Is the sediment supply going to be enough to protect our beaches and protect the river?
Does that answer your question, Murry?
I'm just hoping that we can get as much information out there about the feedback that we're hoping to get back. So just along those lines, Dr. Murray, could you speak to us a little bit about the biodiversity projects like Tatarangi and Wainaki, the restoration project going on there? What does that mean for our Tadafadi?
Well, I think the really the key one to focus on is Wainaki. The catchment is our water supply. We get all of our water from the top of that catchment, the Mangapuhi reservoirs, and also a bush intake in that area. And at the moment, the majority of that catchment is in pine forest. And that pine forest was put in after Cyclone Bowler in an attempt to protect that catchment, to stop erosion. A good part of that catchment is actually in highly erodible land, and we have a pipeline going through the middle of it, which needs to be protected. But like for other areas, we now realise that having pine forests in this area, which you're having to harvest, creates a problem. Excuse me, because at that period of time after that harvest, that landscape is very vulnerable to erosion if we have big storms going through. And so we are rapidly moving in that particular environment to, we're just starting to plant Manaka now in the worst part of that area. And then we gradually, over the next 5 years, going to be moving to planting far more area. Around about 800 hectares of land is going to be converted from what's currently pine forest through to indigenous. And longer term, that'll be a stable forest. It's a joint venture between the council and the local iwi. and also with the forestry company involved as well. And the benefit of that is it's going to extend the Wainaki waterworks bush, which is already an indigenous. So we're going to have this large area of lowland forest develop within Tadafadi, which is pretty unique across New Zealand. And this is going to be a project that is going to have broad implications than just for Gisborne itself. And we already have regional councils in other regions asking us questions about, okay, how does the process working in Tadafadi, and how can they do the same thing in their areas? There are other areas where they're doing conversions through to indigenous forest, but not quite with the same degree of uniqueness as we have here. And so this is a really aspirational project to actually change a landscape from one land use to another in a very, very short period of time. And it is I think, an inspiring project for the region. And it will lead through to other ones. We're currently looking at putting in some applications for funding for the brand new Mangapoiki Lake, which is just over the hill from Wainaki, where this was a lake that you may recall happened in early 2018, very much in a hurry. It wasn't something anybody expected. And now we have a 30-hectare lake in the south of our region there that we didn't have before. And that's now the largest lake in our area. But we have unstable landslide debris, and we have a buried river plain, which is now a lake. And so we're now looking at, with the landowners and the local iwi trust, to actually go and plant the landslide dam itself and the margins, and do a whole lot of other work around biodiversity monitoring, and there looking at what's happening longer term in the lake, and so that it can become both a habitat and a resource for the local community. Tatarangi, Kaity Hill, as some people may know it, right on the doorstep of the city, overlooks the city, and it was all in pine forest, again, for the same reason. People thought that was a really sensible way to protect it from erosion, but we now know that actually having a permanent cover is a very good way of healing that piece of land. And it's, again, a really good cooperative arrangement with the local iwi to actually go and get that project up and running, where we're changing from pine through to indigenous species. And this is going to be a long-term project. And there's really good opportunities here for extending the Tatarangi project to the north towards Sponge Bay, looking at those erodible sort of cliff faces and that sort of coastal zone, and putting in indigenous forestry there that can give us permanent cover that helps protect our coastal zone, heading north towards Sponge Bay, to Hinea Point, and to Wainui.
Awesome. And of course, we're asking our people to give us feedback on biodiversity and restoration projects, whether or not you want us to do more, which could mean an increase in rates, do the same, or do less. So if you could implore, or really impress upon our people how important it is to have those biodiversity and restoration projects, what would you say, Dr. Murray?
Well, I think the key thing about it is we all know that as a council, our capacity to do things within our ratepayer base is pretty limited. And that means we've got to be two things, really. We've got to be smart with our money. So we've got to be efficient about how we do things. And that may mean doing things over a longer period of time, but it also means accessing external sources of money. For example, we have significant number of contributors already through to the Wainaki project. We have a 1BT application in there. We have an external overseas funded agency giving us some money there. And it's one where, bodies on the ground, people doing the work from the local iwi, from council and others, can help sort of ease the burden on ratepayers. But I think that from a longer term point of view, that it's going to be an investment that's going to be really worthwhile.
Thank you. Just going a little bit back and forth now. Hannah, can you speak to us a little bit about what the development of a council climate change response plan might look like and what that involves?
Of course. So we're just at the early stages of thinking about what this might look like, but basically it will, sorry, my throat. Um, my aspiration for the plan is that it sets out some very clear actions about what council's role is in the climate change response. So those three key pillars of mitigation, adaptation, and education. We know that there's a lot to do in this space, and what we heard in the Tadafadi 2050 spatial plan consultation is that many community members want council to show leadership in a way that enables the good things to happen. So we know we can't do everything as a council. We have a limited amount of money that we can use, and we've got a lot of different functions that we need to do. So we'd love to hear what the key things that will enable I guess sustainable and resilient transition to a future that will not only mean that we can live with positive benefits in a different climate, but will have really positive environmental outcomes. So moving forward, what we're hoping to do is start the project planning and initiation process, but what we'll do is use this. We've heard some really great feedback from during the spatial plan development on some of the community aspirations. So we'll leverage off that process and use this early engagement process to hear a little bit more about what you want specifically in the climate change space, because the spatial plan covered almost so many different aspects of life. So we'd love to hear what your values are, and then we can start developing a plan, and we can touch base again, and I assume that might be sort of mid to late next year. And like Murry said, there's a lot of things we can do, like finding funders for research, and maybe we use our planning expertise at council to develop adaptation and mitigation plans, and then moving on to implementation. I think a lot of the time people are like, hurry up and get it done, but there are some things we need to do to ensure that we're doing the right thing, and we can manage the competing interests and all the different environmental and sustainable and resilient outcomes to achieve your Tadafadi 2050 vision or your Tadafadi 2120 vision, because we know that climate change will be a long-lasting issue unless we do some dramatic changes. So yeah, what do you want to hear? What do you want us to see doing as a council within our own organisation and our functions? And is there anything you see us doing for the wider community? Would you like us to be in the regional emissions reduction space? Or do you think other organisations are better placed to be working in that area, and we should focus on more about making sure that our assets are in the right place and that they're running in the most sustainable way? So yeah, that's kind of my pitch. But what we'll do is we've got this engagement process, and then we'll go away and we'll take on your feedback, and then we come back again with our final consultation process. So we check back in and make sure that we heard you correctly, and then we'll have the council action plan consultation process. So there's a few ways you can feed in. This isn't the last chance, and I guess I have an open door policy, so if you ever have a question or want to have a chat or have a great idea, just get in touch. Yeah, that's me.
Awesome, thank you, Hannah. So what we do have right now is a good 15 solid minutes to really unpack, the social pinpoint platform and what it's asking. So I think we've covered climate change. Unless there are any other questions, put them in the chat function now. I think we can move down to environmental care, and I'm referring to the link that's in the chat where we're asking you to put your feedback. Dr. Murry, can you please explain for us what biosecurity and pest management means?
Well, we have the Regional Pest Management Plan, and that drives what we do within the council space. But we have other actors in the area as well, like the Department of Conservation and landowners. And the whole point about pest management is that it's a collaborative effort. The farmers, for example, who are killing goats, they have to rely on their neighbours also killing their goats so that the overall numbers go down. There's no point just killing a few and then having them come back into that space. And so we have key species that we need to worry about. And with climate change, they may change. We will have further pests coming in. We don't necessarily know what they are now. We've been extremely lucky with myrtle rust in Tadafadi, which hasn't seemed to have impacted on us at all compared to other areas. And that's quite important, seeing that Manukau and Kānaka are quite key species in our environment. But our focus has been on things like really around farming protection in the past, like making sure that possums with TB do not get into the region. But we have bigger issues we need to address. And so we have the deer and the raccoonras, which is really being addressed by Department of Conservation, particularly dealing in a joint venture with Ngāti Porou, the local iwi, who have a real ownership of that space. And so we have in areas which is council-owned land, then we obviously have the whole range of pests that we're trying to eliminate, from possums through to goats, through to pigs and deer. And we also have the plant species that are an issue, like nodding thistle. And the responsibility there is on everybody. So it's not just council going out there and solving the problems on everybody else's land. It is really landowners seeing the problems that they have on their own land and actually addressing them themselves. And so we don't have the capacity or the resources to go and actually tackle every single pest plant or pest animal on everybody's property. It's up to the landowners to do their own thing in the space. And we need to be looking at how we deal with this better in the future. We have a landowner in the south of our region, for example, that went and killed 1,900 goats just in the last month or so. And that's a really good amount of goats to get rid of. And we have our own program in Wainaki, where we've been killing quite a few goats there as well. And so goats are an important one, and focusing on goats, because the other things that if we're doing restoration projects or you have Indigenous bush coming back, the other things that chew all the palatable species and actually slow down the process of restoration. And so once you've got that Indigenous cover coming back and protected from your goats and your other browsing pests, then you do have a habitat where you can actually sort of get far more bird song. You will actually be able to protect those. We also have the smaller ones, the mustelids, and the stoats, weasels, rats, and mice to a lesser extent, which directly predate on our bird life. And there are two aspects of that. One, yes, getting rid of those predators in that point of view, but if you actually have a good ground cover, you're increasing the area that's available for those birds to actually have a habitat. So you're reducing the opportunity for those pests to get all of them. But we still need to focus on those mustelids, and that's the focus of the government's 2050 pest eradication program. And the difficulty there is that that program really relies on areas that you can protect from the margins, and that's extremely difficult in mainland New Zealand, and it's extremely difficult in Tatarangi. You could do it at Mahia because it's an island, it's peninsula almost, so you can create a virtual island there, and then you can get rid of all those pests. If you're looking at Wainaki, for example, it's surrounded by areas of pasture and forestry, and so there's pathways for those pests to come back in, and so that's an extremely difficult process, and it makes it a lot harder for us to meet the criteria that central government puts on to get that funding for pest eradication. And I think that's only just part of it, of course, but I guess that might be hopefully making people think about ways that they can help with respect to pests on their own land.
Thank you for that. And just to be very clear, that's one of the key activities that we're asking our people to give us feedback on. And specifically, do you want us to do more of that? Or, you know, could we do less, or should we just do the same? Dr. Murray, can you give us an overview on water catchment plans? I see that's also a key activity that we do in our environment.
Okay, well, we've got two different types of catchment planning, and one of those side of things is not really in my space. I'll quite happily bounce that through to when you're dealing with environmental science and monitoring team, who deal with that to a larger extent. We have the two aspects. One, we have the security of water supply, and so, for example, in the Waipoa, Hannah's already referred to the MAR, Managed Aquifer Recharge, which is to actually give us more water through to for our horticultural use in particular. And so that's really a question managing all of our water takes within the catchment, and so that it's under a lot of pressure. So the people have bore permits, and they're under an allocation reduction scheme at the moment where they can't get all of the water that they may have a consent for. So it's been uniformly constrained across the region. Other areas we don't have the same. We're just going and doing work on water availability in the Uawa catchment and in the Waipu catchment, but that's only part of it. We have to have an integrated approach to this, so it's about having the right land use. Are we using too much water for a particular land use, and can we actually be far more efficient about using water in a catchment? Can we change the land use so that we're not having the same impacts downstream? And so, for example, in the Queen's Birthday storms in 2018, we had not just logs coming down the river, but we had a huge amount of silt, and they have an impact on the river flats, and they also have an impact in the coastal environment. So that sediment smothers kaimoana, as an example. And so we have to think of our catchments in a holistic point of view. So, and I'll let others sort of discuss it a wee bit further, but it's a range of different things we need to do. So farm environment plans that focus on the wise use of land, what land should be kept in protected gullies, for example, with manaka or kānaka, or in the shorter term, willows and poplars, what areas can be in permanent forest, permanent cover, what areas can be safely harvested and safely in forestry. And so it has to be a holistic approach, and we're only just starting to move on that journey towards a holistic view of our landscape.
Thank you for that. And you've already spoken a bit about restoration and biodiversity projects and multi-partner restoration projects. What do we mean when we are asking our people to consider land management?
Again, I think we would really sort of bounce that one through to the integrated catchments team when they get an opportunity to talk rather than me discuss that one. I'm sorry.
That was my question. Okay, I'm going to go to our email. We have a few questions here, and we'll do our best to answer them while we've got you here for the next 8 minutes. Okay, street trees. Why doesn't council plant natives instead of all these exotic trees? It's a bit of a curly one.
Well, I can probably address that partially, but again, it will come in from another team later on, our livable communities team. Where we can, we are gradually transitioning to Indigenous, but we also have to think about the treescape in our urban environment as well. So if we have an avenue of trees, it is extremely difficult to actually just go and cut out all of those and replace them with Indigenous, and do they actually provide the benefits in that particular space? So it's one of those things which is being planned over time, and I understand that our livable communities team will be talking in a later one, and they can go into greater detail there. But there is a plan where appropriate to actually convert from having exotic species to having native species where possible in our road space, and where things like shading and other aspects. And you've got to remember that our Indigenous trees are essentially evergreen, and so that means that you'll have shading throughout the year under those spaces, whereas if you've got some of those exotics, they actually are shed leaves during winter time, and so that sort of improves the light on those roads during winter. Of course, also gives us lots of leaves to clean up, so there are pros and cons on both sides, but I think that's going to be a topic of conversation for a further session.
Thank you for that. Hannah, a bit of a curly question for you. As climate change kicks in, is council likely to introduce any zoning to stop people building so close to the coast?
Thank you, Murry. That is a question that we're definitely considering. So what we have coming up is a review of our Tadafadi resource management plan. So this covers both our district and regional functions. So this is a project my strategic planning team is considering at the moment and how we're going to roll it out. It is a huge project and something that might take around 7 years, but what we need to do is to understand the risks to each zone and do some mapping around what the climate change implications will be, and then work through with the community what an appropriate zone will be. So yes, it's definitely something we're looking at doing, and we'll align the zoning with the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and any other government guidance that comes out. But yes, like that slide I showed you around the Hawke's Bay example, we'll need to have a look at some of the appropriate options for each location first, and then we can embed that within our plan. So that's my understanding about where we're going in that aspect. But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
And I'm sure lots of people care about the answer to that question too. We've got time for a few more. What about our rivers getting so muddy after rain? Is council doing anything about that?
Okay, I guess that's one for me. And it all goes back to the conversation I was having earlier on about the appropriate land use within our environment. And the sediment that we have, at the muddy water, the sediment in our rivers, is coming from our land, and it's being shed off our land through bad land uses in many places, or due to sort of significant events. So we know that we tend to have a lot of sediment influx during the harvest period, and people will recall that there have been a number of court cases recently arising out of the Queen's Birthday storm in 2018, which resulted in quite a lot of harvest waste and sediment getting into particularly the Uawa catchment, but also in other catchments, including the Waiapu. It still reflects the adjustment that the land is going through after things like Cyclone Bowler. It's not a situation where we had a big event like that and all of a sudden it stopped. We had a lot of bare land with huge numbers of slips on it, and they've been gradually treated as a word, or replanted in indigenous, or in some instances in pine. And so over time, those scars get healed, but we still have many of them, and particularly the big, what I call mega gullies. And those are quite a lot of them in the Waiapu, and also we have in the Waipo, we have things like Tarndale Slip. And those things are really intractable problems where we have these very large features generating a lot of sediment, and every single time we have a storm, more sediment comes down. What we can do to solve some of those really big mega gully problems is just a question of time. We have to take the time and tackle all of those. But for the smaller scale ones, we still have landslides on both farmland and in forestry. It is really getting those land uses correct and making sure that we have the waterways protected. So that's having riparian margins planted so that sediment that's on the land can't get through from the land surface through to the streams and rivers. And that also is the case in our horticultural land, where we need to have the appropriate margins between the drains that then feed into the rivers and those areas of intensive horticulture, so that no soil is lost. And that's a transition that's going to take some time to get through. There's no immediate solutions, but it's bigger than just the council. There's more than what we can actually deal with. The landowners have to address some of these issues themselves about a more sustainable use of their own land.
Fantastic. You've done a great job at taking us all the way to the end, Dr. Murray. I'd like to thank you and Hannah for giving your presentations today, and just remind those of you watching via on demand that you can still send us questions about this particular topic to feedback@gdc.govt.nz, and please go to our main website, gdc.govt.nz, to find out how to leave your feedback. And I think we'll end our first online hui there. Thank you, team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ka kite.